The frozen prayer. The night seemed to stretch on endlessly, an expanse of cold and stillness that wrapped around the church like an unyielding shroud. Pastor Whitaker could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on him as he stood next to Tasha. The world outside had become a blur, a haze of snow and ice, but here, inside, it felt as though time itself had paused. It was just the two of them. Tasha, the girl who had knelt in the snow outside, with her head bowed in prayer, and Pastor Whitaker, the man who had found her in her moment of peace. As he stood there, watching her, he found himself grappling with an array of emotions that he couldn't quite name. The quiet strength in her presence was palpable, as though she had lived through countless hardships and had emerged stronger with each challenge. The fire in her eyes, despite everything she had endured, was unwavering. It was as if she knew something about life that he didn't, something he couldn't yet grasp. The church was small, but the warmth that emanated from its ancient wooden beams seemed to hold more than just heat. It was a refuge. Pastor Whitaker could feel the weight of this sanctuary, the years of prayer and devotion that had soaked into the very walls. For a moment, he felt as though he wasn't just in a building, but in the presence of something much greater. Tasha took a seat at the edge of the cot he had set up for her, her eyes scanning the modest room. She was quiet, almost contemplative, as though the world around her had faded into the background. Her movements were slow, measured, as though each step she took required careful thought. Pastor Whitaker couldn't help but wonder what had brought this young girl to this point, what had shaped her into the person sitting before him now. "Tasha," he began, his voice gentle but firm, "I know we just met, but I can't help but feel there's more to your story than what you've told me. Why were you out there, alone in the cold, praying like that?" She looked up at him, her dark eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and wisdom far beyond her years. For a moment, Pastor Whitaker saw a flicker of hesitation in her expression, as though she was deciding whether or not to open up. But then, with a deep sigh, she spoke, her voice steady yet tinged with an underlying vulnerability. "It's been a long time since I've had anyone to talk to, Pastor," Tasha said, her fingers playing with the edges of the blanket that had been draped over her shoulders. "I've learned not to trust people too easily. They either look at me like I'm invisible, or worse, like I'm a problem to be fixed. But I've always believed that I could find peace, even if no one else saw me. Even if the world turned its back on me, I still believed God was with me." Pastor Whitaker was moved by her words. He had seen his fair share of pain and suffering, but something about the way Tasha spoke, the quiet defiance in her voice, touched him deeply. She had been through so much, yet her faith had not faltered. If anything, it seemed to have only grown stronger with time. "You have faith, Tasha," he said softly. "That's clear. But you don't have to be alone in this. The church is here for you, and so am I. Whatever you've been running from, we can face it together. You don't have to carry this burden by yourself anymore." Tasha looked at him for a long time, her expression unreadable. For a moment, Pastor Whitaker thought she might brush him off, retreat further into herself. But then, slowly, she nodded, as though she was willing to take a step toward something new, something she hadn't allowed herself to believe in for a long time. "I don't know how much help anyone can offer," she said, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "But maybe I could use a place to rest. Maybe I could use someone who won't look at me like I'm just another lost soul." Pastor Whitaker's heart swelled with compassion. He had known many people who had fallen through the cracks, who had given up hope, but there was something about Tasha that was different. She wasn't broken. She wasn't defeated. She was just waiting for someone to see her, to hear her, to help her find her way back to herself. "You're not just another lost soul, Tasha," he said quietly. "You're someone who has a purpose. I don't know what it is yet, but I believe it's there. And we'll find it together." She gave him a small, tentative smile, the first genuine smile he had seen from her since their meeting. It was a smile filled with gratitude, but also with a sense of uncertainty. She wasn't sure what to expect next, but for the first time in a long time, She was willing to trust someone. She was willing to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could be different. The night passed slowly, and Pastor Whitaker kept his distance, giving Tasha space to rest and reflect. As she sat on the cot, wrapped in the blanket, her mind raced. The emotions that had been buried deep within her began to surface. Memories of her mother's gentle touch, of her father's laughter, of the way things used to be before everything fell apart. But even as those memories flooded her mind, she found herself drifting towards something else, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. Hope. Hope that maybe she wasn't broken beyond repair. Hope that she could find her way back to a life worth living. Hope that there was still room for her in this world, even if she had been cast aside by so many others. As the night grew colder, Pastor Whitaker sat by the fire in the small office, thinking about the girl who had found her way to him. He couldn't help but wonder about her story. How someone so young could carry so much pain and yet still manage to find peace in the darkest of times. He knew there was more to her than what she had shared, but he also knew that pushing her to reveal everything at once wouldn't help. She needed time. But as he sat there, his thoughts drifted beyond Tasha and the challenges she faced. He couldn't ignore the unsettling feeling that something was happening in the town of Hopewell. It wasn't just the increase in the number of homeless people or the rise in poverty and desperation. It was something deeper, something hidden beneath the surface that only a few people knew about. And as much as he wanted to focus on helping Tasha, he knew he couldn't ignore the signs. Tasha was just the beginning. There were others, too, people in this town who had been abandoned, forgotten, and cast aside. People who, like Tasha, were waiting for someone to see them, to help them. The question was, would anyone step up to make a difference before it was too late? Pastor Whitaker stared into the fire, his thoughts swirling. He knew he had to act. He couldn't let this town slip any further into despair. He had to help Tasha, yes, but he also had to help the entire community. The burden of this responsibility weighed heavy on his shoulders, but he had always believed that faith could move mountains. And now he had to believe it more than ever. As the night grew deeper, Tasha slept soundly, her body finally able to relax after the tension of the past few months. Pastor Whitaker watched over her, his mind racing with plans and prayers. The road ahead would be difficult, but he was ready. For Tasha, for Hopewell, for the people who had been forgotten. And as he stood in the quiet darkness of the church, he knew that something greater was at work. A new chapter had begun, not just for Tasha, but for the entire town. And in that moment, he realized that perhaps the greatest test of his faith was yet to come. Whispers in the shadows. The warmth of the church seemed to wrap around Tasha like a comforting blanket. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt a semblance of safety. Her body had been subjected to the cruel chill of winter for too long, and the warmth of the church was a welcome reprieve. Yet, despite the comfort, something about being inside made her restless. The room, though humble, was a sanctuary of sorts, a place of stillness where her thoughts and emotions could settle, but also a place that somehow reminded her of the things she was running from. Pastor Whitaker had stepped out to grab some food and a few blankets for her, offering the temporary comfort that the church could provide. He had been kind, insistent even, that she rest. Yet despite his good intentions, Tasha couldn't shake the nagging feeling that there was more to her situation than simple exhaustion. There were unanswered questions, things buried deep within her heart and mind that she had pushed aside for too long. She ran her fingers through her tangled hair, staring down at the cot in front of her. Her boots were worn thin, the soles barely holding together, and her clothes, patched and frayed, seemed inadequate for even the slightest chill. But she wasn't thinking about her physical discomfort. No, she was thinking about the journey that had led her here. How did she get to this point? How did a young girl end up alone, wandering the streets in the dead of winter, her only companion being her faith? It had been a long and difficult road, one full of loss, betrayal, and heartbreak. She had grown up in Hopewell, a town where families were tight-knit, and everyone knew each other's business. Her parents had been well-respected members of the community, her father a mechanic, her mother a nurse at the local clinic. But when Tasha was just 12, everything changed. A car accident took her mother's life, leaving her father devastated. He turned to alcohol to numb the pain. And over time, the man she once looked up to became a stranger, someone she couldn't recognize anymore. She tried to be strong for him, to hold their broken family together, but the pain of losing her mother festered within her father. He grew increasingly distant, and one night, when she was just 14, he disappeared without a trace. No goodbye, no explanation, just gone. She was left with nothing but the empty house and the haunting memory of a man who had once been her world. The next few years were a blur of foster homes, shelters, and streets. She had learned quickly that survival required more than just resilience. It required a willingness to fight, sometimes for the simplest of things, like a meal or a warm place to sleep. Her faith had always been a constant source of strength, though. She prayed every day, even when her situation seemed hopeless. God had never abandoned her, even when people had. As Tasha sat on the cot, lost in thought, Pastor Whittaker returned, carrying a small bag of food and a blanket. His presence was calming, his voice gentle as he set the items down on the table beside her. "I wasn't sure what you might like," he said, "but I brought what I could find. You can take your time." Tasha smiled softly, though the weight of her memories lingered in her eyes. She wasn't used to being cared for, and the kindness he offered felt foreign, almost overwhelming. "Thank you," she whispered, picking up the blanket and wrapping it around her shoulders. The warmth of it settled around her, and for a brief moment, she allowed herself to relax. It was as if the layers of tension she had been carrying for years were slowly beginning to melt away. Pastor Whittaker took a seat across from her, his gaze kind but searching. "Tasha, I know you didn't come here just for warmth or shelter," he began. "You've been through a lot. I can see that. But if you're willing to share, I'd like to understand. What brought you to this point? What are you running from?" His question was gentle, but it struck at the core of everything she had tried to forget. Tasha hesitated, her fingers twisting the edges of the blanket. For a long time, she had kept her pain hidden, even from herself. But something in Pastor Whittaker's eyes told her he wouldn't judge her. He wasn't like the others, those who looked away when she passed by, those who saw only a homeless girl and nothing more. "I'm not running from anything, Pastor," Tasha said softly, her voice trembling with emotion. "I've just been trying to survive. Ever since my mom died, everything fell apart. My dad, he just couldn't cope. And then he left. I don't know where he is. I don't even know if he's alive anymore." Pastor Whittaker nodded, his expression softening with understanding. "I'm so sorry, Tasha. Losing your mother like that, and then your father. That's more than anyone should have to bear." Tasha's eyes brimmed with tears, but she quickly wiped them away, determined not to appear weak. "It's not just that, though," she continued, her voice steadying. "It's the way people treat you when they think you're nothing. When you have nothing. I've been to so many places, shelters, food lines, but it's like I don't exist to anyone. They see me as a problem to solve, a burden. I've learned to just keep my head down and keep moving. But deep down, I'm still just lost." Pastor Whittaker leaned forward, his voice low but filled with sincerity. "You're not lost, Tasha. You're here, and you've made it this far. That's something. You're stronger than you realize." Tasha shook her head, a bitter smile tugging at her lips. "I don't feel strong. I feel like I've been surviving for so long that I've forgotten how to live. I don't know who I am anymore." The pastor sat quietly for a moment, absorbing her words. He knew all too well the pain that came with loss and feeling invisible to the world. But there was something in Tasha, something raw, something real, that told him she was not broken beyond repair. She had just been forgotten, like so many others in this town, discarded by a world that had no time for the vulnerable, the forgotten, and the downtrodden. Tasha, Pastor Whitaker said, his voice firm but compassionate, I'm going to help you. Whatever it takes, you're not alone anymore. You've found your way here for a reason, and I believe God has a plan for you. It may not seem clear now, but I promise you, there's a purpose in your pain. Tasha looked up at him, her eyes wide, a flicker of hope sparking within her. She wanted to believe him, to believe that somehow she could start over, that there was more for her than this life of struggle and survival. Do you really think there's hope for me? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Pastor Whitaker smiled, his heart full of compassion. I know there is, and I'm going to help you find it. As he spoke, Tasha felt something stir deep within her, a glimmer of hope, however faint. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, her life could be different, that she could be different. But little did Tasha know, the path she was about to walk would not only change her, but the entire town of Hopewell. Secrets were buried here, secrets that had been festering for years, and they were about to surface in ways that would challenge everything she had ever known. As the shadows of the past began to creep closer, Tasha's faith would be tested in ways she couldn't imagine. The question was, would she be ready? The burden of secrets. The days that followed Tasha's arrival at the church felt like a strange dream, a brief respite from the storm that had been her life. Pastor Whitaker, though deeply committed to his congregation, found himself increasingly preoccupied with the young girl who had walked into his church that night, half frozen and lost. He had been drawn to her from the moment he saw her, not just because of her obvious need, but because of something else, a quiet, unspoken strength that seemed to radiate from her, despite the visible signs of hardship. Each morning, as he opened the doors to the church and let the sunlight spill across the worn wooden floors, he would find Tasha already awake, sitting by the small fire he had built in the corner of the room. Her face would be calm, serene even, but her eyes, those eyes, betrayed a life of hardship far beyond her years. She was only 17, yet she seemed to carry the weight of someone much older. Good morning, Tasha, Pastor Whitaker would say softly, his voice carrying a warmth that contrasted with the chilly mornings outside. Good morning, Pastor, she would reply, her voice low but steady. There was a quiet grace in her demeanor, as though she had learned to live with the weight of the world, but refused to let it break her. It wasn't long before she began helping him with small tasks around the church. She cleaned the pews, dusted the shelves, and helped prepare the Sunday service. It was as though, in some small way, she was reclaiming a sense of purpose, an opportunity to give back in a world that had long forgotten her. But as the days turned into weeks, the burden of her past remained a shadow, lingering just out of reach. Pastor Whitaker knew Tasha was not ready to speak of her life before the streets, and he didn't press her. He could sense that there were deep scars she had yet to confront, and that some wounds, no matter how well-meaning the healing, needed time. It wasn't until one cold afternoon, when the light was beginning to fade from the sky, that Tasha finally spoke of the things she had kept buried for so long. Pastor Whitaker had just finished preparing the evening prayer service when he saw Tasha standing by the window, her eyes fixed on the world outside. The weather had turned bitter again, and the streets were empty, save for the occasional figure hurrying along the sidewalk, their heads down against the wind. She looked small in the dim light, almost fragile, as though the weight of the world was pressing down on her again. Tasha, he called gently, his voice filled with quiet concern. Is everything all right? She turned toward him, her face unreadable for a moment, before she spoke in a voice that seemed so soft it could be mistaken for a whisper. I never thought I'd end up here, she began, her words tinged with an emotion he couldn't quite place. I didn't think I'd make it. Not after everything. You see, Pastor, there's more to my story than just losing my mom and dad. There's more to why I ended up in those streets. More that I've never told anyone. Pastor Whitaker's heart tightened at the vulnerability in her voice. He took a step closer, his presence steady, offering the silence that often spoke louder than words. "You don't have to tell me if you're not ready," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "But know that you don't have to carry this alone. Whatever it is, I'm here for you." Tasha looked down at her hands, her fingers twisting the hem of her coat. She hesitated for a long moment, as though weighing whether or not to continue. Finally, with a deep breath, she spoke. "When my father left, I didn't just lose him. I lost everything. I didn't just lose my home. I lost my sense of who I was. I started to drift, unsure of where I belonged. And then one day, I found out that people in our town had been hiding things, dark things, things that no one wanted to face, not even my father." She paused, her eyes clouding over with memories she clearly didn't want to relive. "I was only 14 when I first discovered that something was wrong. Something that wasn't just about my family falling apart. It was about the way the town was treating people like me, like us. Homeless families, kids like me. They were disappearing. People were going missing. And no one talked about it. No one asked questions." Pastor Whitaker's stomach turned at her words, the weight of her revelation sinking in. What had been happening in his town? What had he missed? "I tried to ask, but people just shrugged it off," Tasha continued, her voice growing more distant. "They said it was just part of the way things were. They said we had to accept it. But I couldn't. I couldn't just let it go." Tasha's eyes locked onto his, and for the first time, Pastor Whitaker saw a fire in her gaze, a determination that made his heart ache. "I started asking the wrong people the wrong questions," she said, her tone quiet but unwavering. "And one night, I overheard something I wasn't supposed to hear. Something that made me realize that it wasn't just neglect. It wasn't just apathy. It was something much worse. There were people in this town involved in something terrible. People with power. And when I found out, that's when everything changed." Her words hung in the air, each one heavier than the last. Pastor Whitaker could see the pain and the fear she was carrying. Fear not just for her own safety, but for the safety of others who had been silenced, people whose stories had been buried beneath the weight of secrets. Tasha looked at him then, her eyes pleading for understanding. "I never wanted to get involved in all of this. I never wanted to make a scene, but I couldn't ignore it. I couldn't let those people keep hurting others. And so, I did what I had to do to survive. I ran." The room fell silent, the weight of her confession hanging in the air like a storm about to break. Pastor Whitaker, for a moment, didn't know what to say. His mind was reeling from what she had just shared. The realization that something dark was at the heart of Hopewell, something that went beyond the struggles of the homeless or the forgotten. There were people in this town who were willing to let lives slip through the cracks, to turn a blind eye to suffering, as long as it didn't affect them. "Tasha," he said, his voice soft but firm, "what you've shared is beyond anything I could have imagined. I'm so sorry you've had to carry this on your own. But I need you to know something. You're not alone anymore. We'll get through this. Together." Tasha's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them away, unwilling to let them fall. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of relief, as though the burden she had been carrying was finally being shared. And for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was hope. That this town, this broken town, could still be redeemed. But as the night wore on, Pastor Whitaker couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The darkness Tasha had uncovered in Hopewell wasn't just something in the past, it was still very much alive. And if they didn't act fast, the consequences could be dire. Tasha's story was only a small piece of a much larger puzzle, and now it was up to him, to them, to uncover the rest before it was too late. The rising tide. The days following Tasha's revelation were filled with uncertainty. Pastor Whitaker could feel the weight of the truth pressing on him, threatening to break the fragile peace that had settled over the church. He couldn't ignore what Tasha had uncovered, nor could he turn a blind eye to the fact that there were forces at play in Hopewell that had been allowed to fester for far too long. As he sat in his small office late one evening, Pastor Whitaker's thoughts raced. The town was on the brink of something terrible. The longer he stayed quiet, the more the darkness would spread. But what could one man, even a pastor, do to stop the secrets of a town so deeply rooted in corruption? And how could he protect Tasha, who had already paid such a high price for uncovering those secrets? The door creaked open, and Pastor Whitaker looked up to find Tasha standing in the doorway. She had a determined look on her face, and for a moment, he could see the fire in her eyes once again. The same fire that had driven her to uncover the darkness hidden in Hopewell. "I need to do something," she said, her voice firm but laced with a tinge of fear. "I can't just sit here and wait. I know what's going on now, and I need to make sure others know too. The people deserve to know the truth." Pastor Whitaker stood up slowly, his heart heavy with the weight of her words. He had known this day would come, the day when Tasha would no longer be content to stay in the safety of the church, hiding from the forces that sought to keep the town in the shadows. But what she was proposing, taking action against the powerful people behind the dark secrets, was dangerous. Too dangerous. "Tasha, I understand your desire to bring the truth to light," he said quietly, his voice full of concern. "But this isn't something we can do on our own. The people who are involved in this, whoever they are, they won't hesitate to hurt those who stand in their way. You've seen how they operate, and they'll stop at nothing to protect their secrets." She stepped closer, her face resolute. "I've already seen what they can do. I've already lived through it, and I'm not afraid anymore." Pastor Whitaker's chest tightened. He had spent years counseling others on faith and hope, on standing up against injustice, but standing here with Tasha, he found himself wrestling with his own doubts. Was it time to take action? Could he, a humble pastor, be the one to lead the charge? Before he could respond, the church bell rang softly in the distance, signaling the evening hour. It was a reminder that time was running out, not just for Tasha, but for the town of Hopewell. "I'll stand by you, Tasha," he said, his voice thick with conviction. "Whatever happens next, I'll stand by you. But we need to be careful. We need to plan. We need allies." Tasha's eyes softened for a moment, gratitude flickering behind them, but the fire in her gaze remained. "We'll find them," she said, her words filled with an unshakable belief. "There are others, people in this town who care, who won't let this happen any longer. We just have to reach them." And so, with Pastor Whitaker's hesitant blessing, Tasha began the next phase of her mission. Over the next few days, she started reaching out to the people she knew, those who had fallen through the cracks, those who had witnessed things but had kept silent out of fear or indifference. She began to gather them, one by one, in secret. Old friends, forgotten faces, strangers who had become her family on the streets. They all began to rally around her. It wasn't long before Pastor Whitaker realized that Tasha had become the leader of something far greater than he had anticipated. She was drawing together a network of people who, for years, had been silenced by fear or a lack of hope. She was giving them a voice, and they were ready to stand with her. But the deeper Tasha delved into the town's secrets, the more she began to realize just how entrenched the corruption was. People she had once trusted, people she had thought were allies, were now revealing their true allegiances. Some were too afraid to speak out, others were too corrupted to care. Even within the church, there were whispers of complacency, of people turning a blind eye to the suffering around them. Pastor Whitaker had once believed that the church was a safe haven for truth, but now, even that sanctuary felt like it was crumbling. One evening, Tasha approached Pastor Whitaker with a grim look on her face. She had learned of a meeting, an underground gathering of the town's elites who had been orchestrating the disappearances and the silence. They were planning something big, something that would cement their control over Hopewell once and for all. If she didn't act fast, she feared that it would be too late to stop them. "We can't wait any longer, Pastor," Tasha said, her voice trembling with urgency. "I know where they're meeting, and I know what they're planning. We have to go there. We have to expose them before they make their move." Pastor Whitaker shook his head, his heart heavy. "We can't do this alone. You're asking me to risk everything. To risk the church, the people here, all for a cause that could destroy everything we've worked for. And the danger to you, Tasha, it's too great." But Tasha was unyielding. "If we don't do this now, Pastor, it'll be too late. I've seen what they're capable of. We're not just fighting for me anymore. We're fighting for everyone who's been left behind, for everyone who's been silenced. This is our chance to stop them." Pastor Whitaker knew she was right. The town had been suffering for far too long, and he had remained complacent for too many years. He had seen the signs, he had heard the whispers, but he had never truly believed it could reach this point. Yet here they were, standing at the precipice of something far bigger than either of them had ever anticipated. Hopewell had been built on secrets, and now it was time to tear them down. With a deep breath, Pastor Whitaker made a decision that would change everything. He would support Tasha. He would help her expose the truth, no matter the cost. Together, they would face the storm that was coming. And perhaps, just perhaps, they would be the ones to lead Hopewell toward redemption. But as they made their plans, the town around them began to stir, like a slumbering beast awakening to the sound of its own destruction. The forces they were about to confront would stop at nothing to protect their secrets, and the journey ahead would be more perilous than either of them could imagine. The unraveling. The air around Hopewell had changed. There was a thick tension hanging over the town, an unspoken awareness that something was about to shift, something big and dangerous. The more Tasha worked to gather the people who would stand with her, the more she realized how deep the roots of corruption ran in Hopewell. It wasn't just a few bad apples. This was a town built on lies, where secrets had festered for decades, and now those secrets were threatening to destroy everything. Tasha's once clear path to exposing the truth was now shrouded in complexity. She had always known the people in power were hiding something, but she hadn't fully understood how far their reach extended. The closer she got to uncovering the details, the more she realized how many were complicit, how many had turned a blind eye for the sake of their own survival. Each meeting she held in the shadows seemed to grow in importance. They had been gathering late at night, in quiet places, the church basement, abandoned houses, hidden alleyways, anywhere that would allow them to speak without fear of being overheard. With Pastor Whitaker's support, Tasha became the voice of the voiceless, rallying the forgotten citizens of Hopewell to rise against the people who had abused their power. But even as hope began to spread, so too did the fear. It wasn't long before they realized that the elites, those who controlled the town's fate, had begun to take notice. One evening, as the town grew quiet under the weight of impending snow, Tasha and Pastor Whitaker met in the church to review the final details of their plan. Tasha had uncovered the location of the meeting, a secluded building on the outskirts of Hopewell, one that was usually locked and off-limits to the general public. It was there that the town's most influential figures gathered, away from the prying eyes of the ordinary townsfolk. "I can't shake the feeling that they know we're onto them," Pastor Whitaker said, rubbing his hand over his forehead as he stared out the window. The soft glow of the streetlights illuminated the snow-covered ground, but there was an eerie quiet that felt unnatural. "You're right," Tasha replied, her voice resolute but tinged with apprehension. "We're running out of time, and we can't afford to wait any longer. They're meeting tomorrow night. We have to expose them before they can do whatever they're planning." Pastor Whitaker's eyes narrowed. "But if we're wrong, if they know we're coming, it could be disastrous. We have to be sure. We can't just walk into this blindly." Tasha placed a hand on his arm, her gaze steady. "Pastor, I've already seen what they can do. I know these people. They won't stop until they've crushed anyone who dares to stand in their way. But if we don't act now, there won't be anyone left to save." There was a moment of silence between them, as though both were weighing the risk of what lay ahead. Finally, Pastor Whitaker nodded. "We do this together," he said quietly, "but we do it with eyes wide open. We won't be fooled by their lies. We won't back down." And so, their plan was set. They would gather the people who had come forward, those who were brave enough to risk everything and confront the powerful figures who had been pulling the strings behind closed doors. They would expose the truth to the whole town, shining a light on the darkness that had held Hopewell captive for far too long. But just as the final preparations were being made, an unexpected visit changed everything. It was late in the evening when a knock at the church door interrupted their planning session. Tasha's heart skipped as she heard the sound. A quick, sharp knock that didn't sound like the usual late-night visitors. Pastor Whitaker stood up and walked to the door, opening it cautiously. To his surprise, it wasn't someone from their group. Standing in the doorway was a man in a dark coat, his face partially obscured by shadows. He didn't look like someone from Hopewell. His eyes were cold, calculating, and there was an air of menace about him. "I need to speak with you," the man said, his voice low and direct. He glanced past Pastor Whitaker and locked eyes with Tasha. "Both of you." Tasha's instincts screamed that something was wrong. She exchanged a glance with Pastor Whitaker, who hesitated before stepping aside to allow the man in. "I'm not here to waste your time," the man continued as he stepped into the church, his gaze never leaving Tasha. "I know what you're planning. I know you're trying to bring everything out into the open." Tasha's breath caught in her throat. How did he know? "You've been asking too many questions," the man went on, his tone now tinged with a quiet, menacing edge. "And now you're starting to dig too deep. You think you're going to expose us, but you don't understand what you're up against. You don't know the people you're dealing with." Pastor Whitaker took a step forward, his voice steady despite the growing tension. "We know enough to know that people have been hurt. People have suffered. This town has been broken, and it's time for the truth to come out." The man smirked, his lips curling into a twisted smile. "You really believe that, don't you? That the truth will set you free. But the truth comes at a price. You're about to learn that. And when you do, you'll wish you'd never started this crusade." Tasha's pulse quickened. There was something in the man's words, something in the way he spoke, that sent a chill through her. She could feel it. A dark presence in the room, a force that was more powerful than anything she had encountered. This man wasn't just a messenger, he was a warning. And if she wasn't careful, he would be the one to stop her. "I'm not afraid of you," Tasha said, her voice strong despite the fear creeping into her chest. "You can try to intimidate me, but I won't back down. I won't stop fighting for the truth." The man's smile faltered for a moment, and his eyes darkened. "I hope for your sake you mean that," he said coldly. "Because if you go any further, it won't just be your life you're risking. It'll be everyone you've ever tried to help." With that, he turned and walked out of the church, leaving Tasha and Pastor Whitaker to ponder his cryptic warning. The door clicked shut behind him, but the weight of his words lingered in the room like a shadow. Pastor Whitaker felt his heart race as he turned to Tasha. "What have we gotten ourselves into?" Tasha's eyes met his, and for a moment, there was only silence. The stakes had just become much higher. What they had planned was no longer just about exposing the truth, it was now about survival. "We're in this together, Pastor," Tasha said, her voice unwavering. "And we're not backing down. Not now. Not ever." The next chapter of their fight had begun, and there would be no turning back. The final stand. The wind howled through the streets of Hopewell, carrying with it the whispers of a town on the verge of something monumental. As Tasha and Pastor Whitaker prepared for the final confrontation, the gravity of their actions weighed heavily on them. The warning from the mysterious man echoed in their minds, a reminder of the danger they were about to face. But there was no turning back now. Hopewell had been broken for too long, and the truth needed to be heard, no matter the cost. Tasha stood in front of the church's small mirror, adjusting her coat as she looked at her reflection. The face staring back at her was not the same girl who had arrived in Hopewell weeks ago. The fear in her eyes had been replaced with a fierce determination, a resolve that had been forged in the fires of adversity. She had seen the worst of humanity and the best of it, and now she was ready to fight for the people who had been silenced for so long. Pastor Whitaker entered the room, his expression heavy but resolute. "Are you ready?" he asked quietly. Tasha turned to him, her eyes unwavering. "I've never been more ready for anything in my life." The time had come. They had gathered the people who would stand with them, those who had been hidden in the shadows, those who had witnessed the injustices and had been too afraid to speak out. It wasn't just about Tasha anymore. It was about Hopewell itself. The town needed a voice, a rallying cry for those who had been ignored, forgotten, and oppressed. Tasha knew that what they were about to do would change everything. The meeting that was scheduled for that night, the one where the town's elite would gather to finalize their plans, was their chance. If they could infiltrate the meeting, expose the truth to everyone present, they might just have a chance to bring the town back from the brink. But the risks were enormous. If they failed, the consequences would be dire. The man who had come to warn them had made that crystal clear. The people they were about to face weren't just corrupt officials. They were dangerous, ruthless, and they would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. "I've never done anything like this before," Pastor Whitaker said, almost to himself. "I've preached about faith, about standing up for what's right. But this is different." Tasha smiled softly, though her heart raced with anticipation. "I think that's what makes this so important, Pastor. We're not just talking about faith anymore. We're acting on it. We're showing the people of Hopewell that they don't have to be afraid anymore." There was a long pause as Pastor Whitaker nodded, the weight of the moment settling over him. "Then let's do it. Together." They made their way to the outskirts of town, where the meeting was set to take place. The building was old, a once grand mansion now crumbling with age and neglect. It had always been an eyesore on the outskirts of Hopewell, but now it represented something far more sinister. Inside its walls, the decisions that shaped the future of the town were being made in secret, away from the eyes of the people. As they approached the building, Tasha's mind raced. She could feel the eyes of the town on them, even though they were alone in the darkened streets. They were all watching, waiting to see what would happen next. This was more than just about exposing the corruption. It was about proving that change was possible, that Hopewell could rise from the ashes and reclaim its soul. Pastor Whitaker gave her a final glance before they stepped inside. "You're sure about this?" Tasha nodded. "We can't back down now." Inside, the building was cold and musty, the air thick with the scent of forgotten years. They crept through the hallways, following the faint sound of voices ahead. The deeper they went, the more Tasha's heart pounded in her chest. The elite of Hopewell were meeting in a large, dimly lit room at the end of a long hallway. They could already hear snippets of conversation, voices low and conspiratorial, speaking in hushed tones about the plans that would ensure their control over the town. "I told you this would happen," a voice said from the shadows. "Once they know, we can't stop them. They're too determined. They won't get far," another voice replied, its tone dripping with contempt. "We've handled worse." Tasha and Pastor Whitaker exchanged a look. They were close. The door to the meeting room was just ahead, but it was guarded by two men who stood at attention, unaware of the intruders approaching. Tasha motioned for Pastor Whitaker to stay behind while she took the lead. She knew this was their one shot to expose the truth. With swift, quiet steps, Tasha approached the guards, her heart racing. She had learned to be resourceful on the streets, how to blend into the background, how to move unnoticed. She drew a deep breath, and with a confidence she didn't fully feel, she spoke. "Excuse me," she said, her voice calm but steady. "I need to speak with someone inside." The guards turned toward her, their eyes scanning her face. For a moment, they hesitated. Tasha knew they would see right through any false story, so she spoke the only truth she could. "I have information that can change everything. You need to let me in." One of the guards exchanged a glance with the other, who nodded. Without a word, they stepped aside, allowing Tasha to slip past them and into the room. Pastor Whitaker followed closely behind, his hand gripping his Bible tightly, a silent reminder of the strength they both carried within them. The room was filled with the most influential people in Hopewell, men and women whose names Tasha had heard whispered in fearful tones. They were seated around a long table, deep in conversation about their plans to keep Hopewell under their control. But as soon as the door opened, all conversation stopped. The room fell silent. "Who the hell are you?" one man growled, his face contorting with anger at the intrusion. Tasha stepped forward, her heart racing, but her voice unwavering. "I'm Tasha, and I'm here to make sure you can't hurt this town any longer. I know what you've been doing. I know what you've been hiding." The room erupted into chaos. People stood up, shouting, accusing one another, scrambling to maintain control. But Tasha stood firm, her gaze fixed on the man who had been the mastermind behind the town's corruption. He was seated at the head of the table, his eyes narrowing as he stood to confront her. "You have no idea what you're messing with," he spat. "Do you think you can walk in here and destroy everything we've built? You're just a little girl." Tasha took a deep breath, the weight of his words trying to shake her, but she refused to let him. "I'm not just a little girl. I'm the voice of everyone you've silenced. I'm the one who's going to make sure your lies no longer control this town." With that, she stepped aside, motioning for Pastor Whitaker to step forward. He stood tall, his Bible in hand, a symbol of their unshakable faith. "We're here to tell the truth," Pastor Whitaker said, his voice booming through the room. "And nothing you do can stop that." The elites, cornered and outmatched by the people they had tried to crush, could only stare in stunned silence as Tasha and Pastor Whitaker began to expose the truth. The lies, the betrayals, the manipulation, all of it came tumbling out in a flood of words that could no longer be hidden. And in that moment, the power of Hopewell shifted. The town had been broken, but now it was rising, like a phoenix from the ashes, ready to reclaim its future. But their fight wasn't over. The road to redemption would be long and fraught with challenges. The battle had only just begun, but they were no longer fighting alone. Together, they would restore the soul of Hopewell.